Anthony Shea went into a place armed, ready to kill, and took as much cash as he could grab.
Police do know the gunfire broke out while wrestling a guard to the ground.
Then he did it again.
Driving an armored car in Boston was like diving into a shark tank with a cut on your leg.
Shea's mother encouraged him, Anthony, you have no money. You got to go out and rob something.
He wanted to be the sort of criminal that people wrote about. After all, you're stealing from a big bank. Nobody's going to get hurt.
The two dead guards are believed to be in the armored truck.
They were both assassinated, professional style.
This was the one that went wrong. It wasn't just fun and games anymore.
3 strikes and you are out.
There was in Charleston a code of silence.
People were intimidated, families were threatened.
Each one of them believed they were going to get away with this.
Those guys had this pact that under no circumstances were they going to break.
To testify against his own brother, that's unheard of.
I just glanced over to look at defendants, and he put his hand up at me and went like this.
At the end of the day, Anthony Shea is spending the majority of his life behind bars.
Now on Gangsters, Anthony Shea and the No Name Gang. August 12th, 1994, Black Friday at Fenway. Never mind that their beloved Red Sox were in 4th place in the American League East, that they'd just been shellacked by the Twins, 17-7.
Baseball is moving further away from its traditional notion as America's pastime and closer to the unpleasant reality of a business.
2 of the most exclusive millionaires clubs in the world were at an impasse over money. Baseball's owners had agreed to share the wealth of the league to level the playing field, but with a catch. They wanted a salary cap, a limit on what their players could earn. The boys of summer refused to accept the terms of the deal.
On the one hand, you got millionaires here, and they're whining about stuff, so I don't really care.
They already have enough money. I mean, why do they need more money?
12 days after the Red Sox hung up their cleats for the year, a 5-man team from a neighborhood not far from Fenway donned their own uniforms and went to work.
As an armored truck was leaving NFS Savings Bank in Hudson, New Hampshire, men with ski masks and sweatsuits approached the truck holding weapons.
They shot one of the guys right there as he stood by the armored truck after the door was open. They went in and they shot the other guy. They took the truck and the guys and drove away.
It happened in Hudson, New Hampshire, 45 miles from Boston. Population, 7,300.
It was a sort of shocking juxtaposition of big city violence in a very small town sort of place.
These perpetrators would obviously be armed and dangerous, and certainly one has to be careful about that.
And it would have been a serious thing if it had happened in Boston. But because it happened in Hudson, it was really horrifying.
I just could not believe it. Why they had to shoot these 2 innocent people. You know, it's sad.
It was the work of professionals.
This gang of armored car robbers took their job very seriously.
They knew how these crimes were investigated.
They wore masks. They wore multiple layers of clothing.
They knew how to dispose of forensic evidence.
They steal cars to use as the getaway cars.
You know, they would burn all their getaway cars.
This was their business. This is what they did. You know, not to glorify it, but it was routine for them.
But what happened in Hudson was not routine.
This was an unusual armored car robbery. It involved the theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars, but far more importantly, it involved the cold-blooded murder of 2 innocent individuals.
One guard was shot at the scene. Both were thrown into the getaway van. Their bodies, 57-year-old Lawrence Johnson and 53-year-old Ronald Normando, were found in a wooded area just a mile from the bank.
Just happened to be, the wrong town on the wrong day.
The killings were a mistake, but not the only mistake.
One of the getaway cars that was used was found burning in Revere.
In the trunk, authorities found jumpsuits, about $1,000 in loose bills, and bags from the Federal Reserve.
They tried to torch it with all the ski masks and the jumpsuits in it.
One of the things found in the back of the burning car was a Boston Bandits t-shirt.
The Boston Bandits are a softball team in the Massachusetts prison system. Police believed the killers had done time and that they were likely from Boston. There was only one logical place to turn for answers.
We knew that they were from Charlestown.
Charlestown is about a mile square, and that square mile has produced more armored car robbers than any square mile in the world.
I don't really know that it's fair to talk about the culture of Charlestown. I can tell you that, in my experience, the vast majority of the bank and armored car robbers have come from Charlestown that I've investigated.
In the early 1990s, one Charlestown gangster had an amazing streak of successful heists. Anthony Shea was part of the No Name Gang. By the time their run was done, they'd easily cleared $1.5 million. They'd be locked up for robbery, racketeering, conspiracy, carjacking, assault, and murder.
Shea was prolific. I mean, he robbed dozens and dozens of banks and probably an equal number of armored cars. Aside from being a dedicated bank and armored car robber, he was a drug abuser, a racist, a misogynist. He was completely bereft of any morals or principles.
Anthony Shea was a successful criminal, but he pushed the envelope, went too far.
Eventually, greed, overconfidence leads to the downfall, and you start making mistakes.
In 4 years of knocking over banks and armored trucks, Hudson, New Hampshire was Shea's first major mistake, but it wasn't his last. 1 year after Hudson, Londonderry, New Hampshire.
Local Londonderry PD has found blood evidence that they believe belongs to the suspects.
For the first time, we had something left behind from the suspect, and that was blood from a window that he broke to get in.
Wakefield, Massachusetts, just 1 week later.
After the botched attempt up in Londonderry, we were lucky enough to find Shea in a stolen vehicle.
Anthony made several major mistakes that a real professional, true professional, would not have made.
Anthony Shea picked the wrong time to get sloppy.
Violent repeat offenders who prey on the rest of us will face life imprisonment under the 3 strikes and you're out measure.
On the very same day in 1994 that Shea and his gang robbed and brutally executed the 2 guards in Hudson, the U.S. Senate approved the law that would put him away for life.
If you're caught on your 3rd felony and you're convicted, then you're considered pretty much a career criminal. 3 strikes, you're out. You get life in prison without parole.
With baseball done for the year, President Clinton borrowed from the boys of summer and took a swing at hardened criminals.
Now, those who commit crimes should be punished. When you commit a 3rd violent crime, you will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out.
To get Anthony Shea and his no-name gang, authorities would have to break through a code among thieves that hung like a black cloud over Boston for generations.
These people are stone killers. They don't care about human life.
It was imperative that none of these individuals ever see the light of day outside of a federal correctional facility again.
1992, Anthony Shea was 28 years old and one of the most successful gangsters on the eastern seaboard.
Anthony Shea is, for me, he's an old-timer. Today, there are people who hack into LinkedIn, steal 6 million passwords, and post them on a Russian crime website. All of a sudden, they're going to start to have 400,000 different credit cards they're using and steal hundreds of millions of dollars. Those are the savvy new thieves of today. But Anthony Shea is old school. What I mean by that is he looked around and said, hey, where's the money? Oh, yeah, money's in the bank. Once in a while, they transfer it between banks in armored cars. He took money the old-fashioned way, went into a place at great risk, armed, ready to kill, and took as much cash as he could grab.
He's highly skilled. He certainly devoted most of his energies to being the best that he could be. And he probably is one of the best that there has been in the past 20 years in this area.
Anthony Shea came up in Charlestown, Massachusetts, a largely Irish enclave just north of downtown Boston.
It's actually a beautiful community. It has beautiful old brownstone-type buildings surrounding Bunker Hill. Then on the northern side, there's a perimeter of housing projects, the Old Town projects, the Mishuan projects.
Shea lived back in there, down near the Medford Street projects.
Charlestown is incredibly small and dense and tight. And it really contributed to the growth and flourishing of the criminal underworld there because it's like a big rabbit warren. There's all kinds of little passageways and secret shortcuts that, everybody knows about and except the cops. And so it's a great place if you're looking to hide. There's 17 cousins of yours who can give you some help if you're in trouble.
Charlestown helped turn the tide of the American Revolution with the Battle of Bunker Hill. By the 1860s, it was a major port and shipyard.
The people coming off the boat have a tendency to settle as close to where the boat lands as possible. And so that's when Charlestown really took on an Irish character. And it stayed that way for, the next century, basically.
By 1960, it was home to the fiercest Irish gang this side of Dublin, the Charlestown Mob.
There was in Charleston a code of silence. That code of silence meant that you didn't speak about what went on. You kept quiet about anybody else around you.
You could get killed for being seen with the wrong guy, for walking down the street in the same direction as the wrong guy. You knew that if you were considered to be a rat or a squealer, you could and probably would be killed.
You wouldn't give up anybody for fear of retaliation or retribution against themselves or their families.
1975 to 1992, 17-year period. 49 murders, 33 go unsolved. They can't break the case because they can't get anyone to talk.
People were intimidated. Families were threatened. They'd be afraid to appear before the grand jury. They'd be afraid to testify in court. So it was very tight-lipped.
For instance, there was a guy in the Irish mob standing in front of a pizza place in downtown Charleston, shot and killed. And there were people all around. And when the police came in, guess what? Couldn't get a statement. No one saw it. No one saw the shooter. No one heard anything. No one knew anything. That's how Charleston was.
By the 1990s, Charlestown had developed a reputation amongst law enforcement.
The family business that got passed down from father to son became bank robbery and armored car robbery.
There certainly is ample evidence that some of the most highly skilled bank and armored car robbers this country has ever known have come out of Charlestown. So they've learned from each other.
It was incredibly specialized. There were families of getaway drivers. You had people who would do nothing but figure out the routes of armored cars.
Those of us who have traditional jobs assume that as a child, you're always going to make a choice to do something legitimate, whether it's being a rock star or a sports athlete, a doctor, a dentist. But the choice for people who grow up around gangsters, who are the second and third generation, their role models are in fact gangsters.
Shea's mother actually encouraged him to go out and rob. Anthony, you have no money. You got to go out and rob something. Go do something. Go do something.
He'd been convicted twice before the age of 25 for robbery and assault. At age 16, he'd robbed a cab driver in Charlestown and nearly killed him.
Looking at Anthony Shea alone, I think all of his brothers have bank robbery convictions.
Shea said in an interview to another journalist, "You know, I grew up around people. This is what they did. If we had grown up around dentists, we would have been pulling teeth."
In Charlestown, the family business started early.
You sort of had to prove yourself as a youngster. Anthony Shea definitely served a criminal apprenticeship, you know, stick-ups, stealing cars, that sort of thing.
Shea said in the 70s as a kid, he could hang out in an alley and somebody would come by and say, "By the way, I need you for a job," as a teenager. And they'd take him out and they'd use him as part of a job and drop him back off on that street, and they'd never talk to him again. He'd never see him.
You didn't make your rep in Charlestown by being a drug dealer. You made your rep in Charlestown by knocking over an armored car, by knocking over a bank. It was a calling to him, and you know, like a lot of Charlestown guys, he wanted to be good at it.
He'd honed his craft over several years and found a no-name crew of like-minded gangsters.
This particular ring had 5 individuals.
In Charlestown, the suspects looked like they could be anybody.
Anthony Shea, Matthew McDonald, Michael Halloran, Stephen Burke, and Patrick McGonigal. If you were to meet Stephen Burke or Michael O'Halloran walking down the street, you would look at them as an educated, respectable, decent-looking human being. Short hair, well-dressed, fit. These guys were highly trained, highly committed armored car robbers, devoting every aspect of their life to stealing as much money as they could, and were completely unafraid of taking lives if it was necessary in order to achieve their goals.
In 1992, bank robberies nationwide reached an all-time high. Boston was witnessing at least one armored car heist a month.
Was pretty prolific in terms of pulling these kind of jobs. That particular gang of guys was looked at as, you know, the big fish in terms of the number and the sort of high-profile jobs that they were pulling.
They garnered federal attention.
There was a bank robbery task force based in Boston that had been following Charlestown bank robbers for years.
Banks and the money they transfer in armored cars are protected by federal insurance. So bank robbery is a federal crime. And it has been ever since the days of J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI.
We began working closely with the FBI and basically had a complete resume of who the elite players were, if you will, in Charlestown.
What we would call the usual suspects.
The one name they kept seeing was Anthony Shea.
Wasn't just a guy who, you know, committed crimes because, you know, he had nothing better to do. He wanted to be the sort of criminal that people wrote about.
Careful what you wish for. Throughout the first half of the 1990s, the longest unbeaten streak in New England belonged to a gangster named Anthony Shea.
A $600,000 sum was taken from a Lynn, Massachusetts armored truck this afternoon.
The robbers of the armored car in Seabrook, New Hampshire got away with nearly $300,000.
All told, is believed that he helped plan and execute more than 100 armed robberies, stealing millions of dollars without a trace.
Shea generally liked to rob with the same people all the time.
They were called the No Name Gang.
And they were no name. 5 gang members at this time, all of them members of the Irish mob.
Anthony Shea, Matthew McDonald, Michael Halloran, Stephen Burke, and Patrick McGonigal.
All of them were from Charlestown.
They developed a modus operandi, if you will, as to how to approach an armored car takedown. They would study a bank or a series of banks and the delivery schedules of armored cars. They would plot out their getaway routes.
The standing rule that Shea had was the crew that was going to rob together stayed together the night before. There was no going out. There was no drinking, drugging, nothing. The morning of the robbery, they would get up, they would shower, shave, and they would put on running suits with long underwear underneath. They would use duct tape to tape the wrists and ankles of these running suits so that there would be no trace evidence by way of hairs or fibers.
The first order of business would be the getaway cars.
They would use a screwdriver to crack the steering wheel to get the car going. And then they would stab the screwdriver into the passenger seat. They liked to steal Chevy Lumina vans to use as the initial getaway car because they were fast, with tinted windows. The robbers wouldn't be seen until the point that the side door swung open and they sprung from the van.
They would mask up and then wipe down their weapons that they were going to use. They would wipe down the actual bullets that would go into the magazines to remove any potential fingerprints.
And then Shea and his gang went to work.
Robbing an armored car it's almost like a ballet because timing is everything. It's choreographed, and when they're coming out of the bank and getting into the armored car, you gotta hit them quick, you gotta grab the money, and you gotta get out of there as fast as you can.
Over a matter of years, the No Name Gang became a well-oiled machine.
You develop some type of sense of invincibility, and you're untouchable. You got away with 9 armed robberies before this, and what's 1 more? What's 2 more?
I think for a while in the early 90s, it almost had sort of the atmosphere of a bit of a game, you know, like a good old cat and mouse chase. Everybody took it seriously, but it was a sort of, you know, kind of made for TV stuff.
38 bags of cash were being loaded into a Brinks truck. They took 34 of them and escaped.
The dollar amounts were sort of a matter of amusement. You know, the bigger the money, the bigger the wow factor.
They weren't the only armed robbers in Charlestown.
On one occasion, they were lying down in a stolen van waiting for the armored car to arrive. And we learned through one of the informants that they looked across the way and saw another one of their friends, another Charlestown bank robbery, who was scoping out the bank at that very time, looking to rob the very same bank.
Driving an armored car in Boston in that era was like, you know, diving into a shark tank with a cut on your leg.
Anthony Shea had employed and empowered his No Name Gang during a national recession. In 1991, Boston's unemployment rate reached 9.1%, the highest it had been since 1976, when the Charlestown mob was running the streets.
I mean, if you're growing up in the projects in Charlestown, you know, you don't feel sympathy for some bank that's based in downtown Boston or New York. It didn't seem like it was the worst thing in the world, because after all, you're stealing from a big bank, right? You're not taking some poor lady's lunch money. You know, nobody's gonna get hurt.
Every streak eventually comes to an end.
Hudson was the one that really went bad, and that was inevitable.
The no-name gang's most notorious robbery went wrong because the machine had broken down. Spoiled by success, Anthony Shea had become an addict.
Shea and Matty McDonald were heavily into drugs, heroin, at this point in time.
Stevie Burke and Michael O'Halloran were not themselves drug users. Anthony Shea and Matthew McDonald were. And Burke and O'Halloran frowned upon Shea and McDonald's use of drugs because it made them less sharp, less effective, less motivated.
Murphy's Law, eventually the law of average is going to catch up to you, and something really bad is going to happen.
When the no-name gang pulled into the parking lot of the NFS Savings Bank on a Wednesday morning, August 25th, 1994, Shea and McDonald were high on heroin.
The actions of the junkies caused the initial shooting. It was an accidental discharge that shot one of the guards in the stomach. They picked him up, they threw him into the armored car.
As guard, Ron Normando lay bleeding in the Lumina, begging for his life. The driver of the armored truck, Larry Johnson, put up a fight.
Their fate was unfortunately sealed when the driver wrestled with Stephen Burke and ripped his mask off. There was absolutely no way either one of those guys was going to be allowed to live. If there was the slightest possibility they could provide any type of a physical description of the assailants.
They were both executed, assassinated, professional style.
The two bodies of the dead security guards found in an abandoned armored vehicle and a stolen Chevy Lumina will be investigated for any more evidence that can help the officials make an arrest.
It wasn't just fun and games anymore. It wasn't funny anymore. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't cute.
It was murder in the first degree.
It was cold-blooded, and it was clear up to the highest levels of law enforcement in New England, even in Washington, that they had to do something because it had gotten way out of control.
As you can see, the crime scene van has just arrived, and they're going to have to go in now and do the crime scene investigation.
We got to do something about this because, you know, people are scared.
On August 24th, 1994, Anthony Shea and his Charlestown gang of no-name bank robbers knocked off an armored car in Hudson, New Hampshire. They made off with nearly $500,000 after executing the two men guarding the truck.
These perpetrators would obviously be armed and dangerous.
That's when things kind of changed during the investigation of the murders of the guards in Hudson, New Hampshire.
It was a cold-blooded killing in a sleepy little town. The kind of crime that can never be explained. One that never goes away. The FBI picked up the trail in May of 1995. 1,400 miles due south.
Customers and workers inside the Barnett Bank were shaken and scared, and some could barely describe what had happened. Police say 2, possibly 3 armed men attempted to heist this Brinks truck in the bank's parking lot.
The attackers had sprung from a blue van.
The gunmen who came for money left empty-handed, with a little help and luck.
A few yards from the attack, 2 federal agents happened to be making a deposit at the bank.
We all thought that the bank had been robbed. We didn't know anything about the Brinks truck, so we thought the bank had been robbed. And that's why we took off after them.
One of the retreating gunmen dropped this high-powered automatic rifle before jumping into a white Jeep Cherokee.
All signs pointed to the work of Anthony Shea. They would leave stolen cars staged at different positions.
Witnesses say they bailed out of the Cherokee and then jumped through the hole in that fence, where on the other side they had another getaway car waiting.
And they'd cut a hole in the fence and leave a getaway car on the other side. The object there was so that if they were being chased by the police would be stopped at that point and would no longer be able to follow them. And that actually happened in West Palm Beach, Florida.
A simple credit card check showed Anthony Shea was in West Palm Beach at the time of the attack. 3 months later, he was back in New Hampshire, not far from the scene of the armored truck killings. Almost exactly 1 year after Hudson, another bank was hit in New Hampshire. Londonderry, August 1995.
Our bank wasn't just picked out by chance. They probably sat out there for several days, several weeks, perhaps learning the routine.
Londonderry was a little bit more daring and a little bit more notorious.
They timed it when the bank closed, when all the customers were gone.
They planned to hit the bank at closing time, but before the vault was closed for the day.
They threw a rock through the window of the bank and burst through the window.
Unfortunately for them, the bank vault was probably closed only minutes before they happened to come in. The manager explained that they could not open the vault because once it's locked, it cannot be opened again until the following day. And fortunately, the two robbers, frustrated, believed them, didn't kill them. They were very lucky and fortunate to have survived that.
For the first time in 5 years, Anthony Shea robbed a bank and left something behind.
They'd left out through the same window, and one of them, Anthony Shea, we believed, cut himself.
Shea left behind a few drops of blood.
We retrieved the blood samples, and they were preserved in our evidence and then turned over to the FBI to then have them analyzed at their lab. Tangible evidence rather than just circumstantial.
These days, you can go to the CVS and buy a DNA swab kit for your, and stick it in your own mouth and send it away and have your own DNA analyzed. Back in the early 90s, that wasn't the case.
We didn't have the DNA back right away, but based upon the MO, we knew it had to be Shea.
While waiting for the DNA results, they began tracking Shea's every move.
The advantage that the feds have is they can essentially flood the zone with agents and investigators and forensic experts.
The biggest break we got in this case was when we were actually able to proactively get on Anthony, get on his small crew, get them off the street.
The week of August 7th, 1995, authorities took to the streets of Charlestown to take down a gangster.
Basically, after Londonderry, we had just gone back to our full court press of intense surveillance on him, and we were able to uncover the fact that it looks like he's looking at a couple of banks.
They found him driving a Jeep and followed him to a Holiday Inn in Peabody, a suburb north of Boston.
It was a stolen vehicle. We watched Shea ditch the stolen vehicle, stash it, let it cool off, and we bugged that vehicle.
The night of August 10th, with the Red Sox in first place and riding an 11-game winning streak, Shea stayed at the Holiday Inn with two new Charlestown teammates, John Shurko and Nicholas DiMartino. The next morning, the FBI were listening when Shea and his team made their move. They were taken down in the parking lot of the Wakefield Savings Bank in Wakefield, Massachusetts.
Both Shea and Shurko were extremely surprised, very surprised. Shurko, he had a MAC-10, a fully automatic weapon with two magazines taped together on his lap. We brought them back to the Boston office of the FBI for booking, and the cold, hard investigative facts were laid out for them. Shea basically stood tall and basically said, I have nothing to say to anybody about anything. I transported him to the overnight holding facility, and he was getting dope sick when we were bringing him into the lockup in Brookline.
Even while suffering heroin withdrawals, Anthony Shea maintained Charlestown's code of silence. But his new partner in crime did not keep quiet.
Shurko decided that he was tired of the life and that he wanted to cooperate.
Authorities also flipped a young carjacker who had been stealing vehicles for the No Name Gang. They began arresting the usual suspects.
The core individuals, Burke, Conley, O'Halloran, McGonigal, those guys really had this pact that under no circumstances were they going to break. I sat down with Michael O'Halloran the morning of his arrest, laid everything out for him, and he looked at me and he told me to go F myself. Those were his exact words.
Each one of them believed they were going to get away with this. And in fact, no one who was a part of that armored car gang did break ranks and cooperate with the government. Not a single one.
They didn't have to talk. Even behind bars, Anthony Shea was still making mistakes.
Anthony was in the Massachusetts correctional system. He met up with a fellow Charlestown gangster by the name of James Ferguson. And Shea was relieved to see him, to see a friend, somebody he could trust, somebody who he thought he could talk to.
Ferguson had become an informant. He was wearing a wire.
James Ferguson was relaying each and every detail that Anthony Shea would share with him directly back to the FBI.
If you've got a web of deceit and silence, and one thread of that web starts to unravel, eventually the whole thing falls apart.
To hear an insight into that type of lifestyle was chilling.
There's always somebody who breaks the code of silence. So this was an astonishing moment in the history of the Irish mob.
On August 11th, 1995, Anthony Shea's 5-year streak of clean getaways came to an end. While in jail for a robbery attempt in Wakefield, Massachusetts, he unwittingly told an FBI informant about a cold-blooded killing a year before in New Hampshire.
Anthony Shea admitted that one of the robbers jammed a .45 caliber pistol into his mouth and blew his brains out. The FBI had not released that fact to the media. And so when we learned that Shea had made that statement, it had inherent credibility to it, because who else would know but someone who was directly involved?
His lawyers said, hey, you can't use that conversation. You can't use it because he had already asked for his lawyer. So you couldn't send in anyone to get any admission from him unless you notified him that that person was working for the federal government as your agent, and therefore he had a right to be silent. And the feds got it in on a real technicality.
Shea was initially arrested only for the Wakefield attempt, not for the Hudson killings he had confessed to while in jail.
He hadn't been charged with that crime yet. They were waiting to charge him. He admitted all of the involvement in the big crime with the double murder. The judge said, since you weren't charged with the double murder yet, you didn't have a right to counsel on that. It's all admitted, and he was sunk.
The taped jailhouse confession was only the beginning. The No Name Gang was charged in a far-reaching federal conspiracy that involved carjacking, robbery, and murder. The trial began September 16th, 1997.
In a case like this, where there's an ethos of a code of silence, it's very difficult to develop witnesses with reliable information. You need forensic evidence to crack the case.
Prosecutors showed the jury pictures of tire prints from Chevy Luminas and screwdrivers stuck into passenger seats.
In Seabrook, New Hampshire, in Lynn, Massachusetts, in Hudson, New Hampshire, in West Palm Beach, Florida. And when the jury saw that, you could almost sense that they knew all of these robberies were linked.
And then there was blood.
There was a brand new scientific method of extracting data from one's blood or DNA called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. It had never been admitted in any court in New England, to my knowledge. It was fascinating to see how minute pieces of evidence, carpet fibers, saliva on a mask, could be matched to, of the 300 million people in this country, to these 5 people in Charlestown, Massachusetts.
Throughout, the No Name Gang seemed unfazed.
When I was getting ready to testify, I just glanced over to look at defendants, and Stephen Burke just put his hand up at me and went like this. In the courtroom. I mean, that was the brazen attitude of these guys.
They would unravel when Charlestown's code of silence came undone. The prosecution called John Burke, the brother of defendant Stephen Burke.
He himself was in jail at the time. He had a history of doing bank jobs with his brother out in Arizona in the early 80s. And he was looking at probably the rest of his life in jail.
The older brother, John, gets on the stand and testifies against everybody else. The 5 defendants who were still in the defendant's row, when Burke testified, were giving him the eye of death, the look of, if we ever come across you or your family at any point in the future, we will take our time in killing you.
For John to come forward and testify, not just testifying, period, which was anathema in Charlestown, but to testify against his own brother, that's unheard of.
Burke's testimony was beyond damning. His words rang out through Charlestown.
At one point during the trial, his brother Stephen stood up and said, and pointed to his family, their mutual family, and said, "Look, here's your family. Are you proud of yourself?" John Burke put that first crack in that dam that eventually, blew things open in Charlestown. People who were involved in that hardcore criminal life in Charlestown realized that, once that line had been crossed, things were never going to be the same again.
On December 22nd, 1997, Christmas came early for the town of Hudson, New Hampshire. Anthony Shea and his no-name gang were all found guilty.
They didn't show any reaction whatsoever. They were cold-blooded professionals right to the end.
They knew that this was a possible outcome for their actions.
It was a good win for the good guys for a change.
One week after opening day in 1998, Anthony Shea, a 3-time convict, was convicted to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
There is a provision in the bill before us that would address this situation called 3 strikes and you're out, meaning 3 violent felonies, mandatory life in prison.
3 strikes, you're out.
There was a tremendous impact, and it all started with Shea.
The heyday, that Shark Tank feeding frenzy, those days were over.
He lived the high life for those years that he was out and able to wreak havoc. But at the end of the day, he's spending the overwhelming majority of his life behind bars.